Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. This year commemorates the 40th anniversary of the Galugaras of June and November 1984. This 4-week course will provide you with an overview of Sikh-India relations from the 1930s to the eve of the June 1984 attack on Harimandar Sahib. So today, we will examine the political situation in Punjab and India under British colonization in the lead up to independence and partition. Before we start, I'd just like to introduce you to today's instructor, Santbir Singh. He is a research associate at the Sikh Research Institute. Santbir Singh is currently pursuing his PhD in sociology at York University. His research focuses on Sikh activism and the inherent relationship between Sikhi and anarchism, explored through historical and contemporary Sikh movements, such as the Kisan Morcha or the farmers' protests of 2020 to 2021. I'll pass it on to Santbir Singh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Really wonderful to be here today. I'm really excited to be doing this 4-week course with everybody. The impetus for doing this course was to give a background to what happened in 1984. And here on the 40th anniversary of 1984, I thought it was more important than ever to explore the background of why 84 happened, looking at the threads going back, quite far into South Asia's history, into India's history, to look at what led up to 84, because 84 didn't just happen in a vacuum, of course. 84 happened because of long-standing policies of the Indian government against the Sikhs. And some of these policies and ideas against the Sikhs actually started before 47, before partition and independence in 1947. So this course will be starting, and this week we'll be starting looking at the 1930s, going up into the 1947 partition and independence. And then in coming weeks, we'll be exploring the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then the early 80s, of course. So this week, the session is called Promises and Partition. And the promises that we're going to be talking about is the promises that were made to the Sikhs, Sikh leadership, and to the Sikh people pre-independence partition in 1947. So we're going to start looking at things going back to the 1930s, actually. You could start the story even earlier. You could start the story in the 1840s, when Sikh Raj ended under Maharaja Dalip Singh. You could start the story in the 1870s or 1880s, when Sikhs first started to organize against the British in a coherent way. Or you could start the story in the 1920s, when the morchas first began to free gurdwaras from British control. So there's a lot of places where you can start the story. But we've decided to start in the 1930s because otherwise it becomes too big, too large, in fact, to handle all of that information within a 4-week course. So let's start right at the beginning, which is the end, actually, of British rule in South Asia. As World War II ended, so we're talking about the 1940s, mid-1940s, it became clear that the UK, the British, were going to leave South Asia. They had made certain promises to Indian leaders that they would leave India and that the end of colonial rule would happen soon. What's really important to remember in this narrative, in the story of the British leaving India, is that this did not happen as a revolution. This was not a people's revolution where people overthrew the British and installed their own government. Instead, this was much more an organized and managed end of colonial rule. The independence of India and Pakistan can be understood as a transfer of power between elites, in fact. So the British didn't just leave, they left with an organized system The Indian and Pakistan governments took over the colonial apparatus, colonial court system, colonial government, colonial state structure, colonial district structure, colonial highways, colonial train systems. Everything was taken over systematically by these new governments. It was not a sort of popular uprising against the British. There were aspects of that, definitely. There was popular protests, there was struggles, there were people who were executed by the British, there were people who protested against the British. But as a whole, the end of British rule in South Asia, in India, really needs to be understood as a transfer of power. And the reason why this is important for our story is that a lot of the systems that the British put in place before they left continued on after the British left. So the laws that the British enacted were still laws that applied after 1947. Laws like the Sikh Gurdwara Act of 1925. So that the different colonial structures that existed before 47 continued to exist post 47. In the negotiations with the British, there were different competing groups, and we can see two of the main competing groups here in this picture. In the middle is Lord Mountbatten, the last British Governor General of India. On the left of the image, looking downwards, is Jawaharlal Nehru, who led the Indian National Congress Party. On the right of the image is Muhammad Jinnah, who led the Muslim League. The Muslim League and Congress were the two main groups that were negotiating with the British for the end to British rule. And they were the ones who were mainly consulted on how British rule would end, how things would end up after the British left. There were a lot of discussions back and forth about what the structure of India and any other future countries in the subcontinent would look like, who would be in charge, what form of government there would be, what type of democracy would be installed, whose vote would matter, what the borders of this country would look like. All of these things were being negotiated. In the front of the image, you can see a Sikh representative, Baldev Singh. So Sikhs did have a seat at the table, but we were not a major player in the sense that while we were consulted on many of the decisions that the British made, our demands were not always taken by the British into consideration. The demands of Congress and the demands of the Muslim League were the demands that were most considered by the British in the leaving, in their transfer of power when they left India. Congress claimed to be a secular party, meaning that it represented all Indians, but in reality, it was dominated by North Indians of upper caste Hindus. The Muslim League claimed to represent all of India's Muslims. When it first began, it didn't really represent all of India's Muslims, but as time went on, more and more Muslims started to throw their power behind the Muslim League. Muslim population of India was quite significant, but it was also concentrated in certain areas. And so there was a question, would the Muslims stay in a united India, or would the Muslims form a separate government? So these are the two main parties that are struggling for independence, that are in negotiations with the British. The Muslim League was very wary of Congress, and they demanded that Muslim interests be safeguarded in any future independent India. Whereas the Congress Party wanted a country governed by a simple democracy, meaning every person gets a vote, with no safeguards for minorities. The Muslim League believed that this would be a catastrophe for India's Muslims, that if every citizen was simply given a vote and there were no protections for minorities, that the Hindu majority of India would quickly dominate the new country, and that Muslims would be excluded, would be persecuted, would be discriminated against, and that in order to safeguard Muslim citizens in a future independent South Asia, India, that there would need to be some real changes in the way that the system operated, meaning some type of safeguards for minorities. As India started to move to self rule, there were different sort of formulas and systems that were proposed to appease India's Muslims. And there was a lot of discussion back and forth. There were a lot of meetings back and forth. There was a lot of protests back and forth between Congress and the Muslim League. And essentially, the Muslim League, very much so, wanted to, got to a place where they decided that the best way for India's Muslims to be protected was to have a separate country from the Hindu majority, and that this separate country would be all of the Muslim dominated areas of India. You can see on this map, the green is where there is a Muslim majority in the country. And you can see that it includes the state of Punjab. It includes all of what is now modern Pakistan and some areas that are not part of modern Pakistan. It also includes areas of what is now modern Bangladesh in the east of India. So the Communal Award was this idea that based on one's religion, the system would operate, that you had a certain amount of power based on your religion, so that Muslims could vote as a bloc, and a certain number of seats were safeguarded for them from the Hindu majority. This was to try to protect them as a minority. The Communal Award was seen as a, how can I put it? It was seen um, as a compromise, but it was a compromise that ironically hurt other minorities. So while it safeguarded the rights of Muslims in India, it didn't safeguard the rights of minority populations in Muslim dominated areas. So, for example, that would be Punjab. So while Punjab was majority Muslim, Sikhs were a minority within Punjab, and our rights were not being safeguarded. So the Communal Award was just for Muslims in India. It was not for other minorities. And this obviously very much upset Sikhs. Here on this map, and I don't want you to confuse the chart on the right with the map, the colors are different, but you can see right here that this is a map of Punjab, pre-partition Punjab. The green areas are Muslim dominated areas. The red areas are non-Muslim dominated areas, so Hindu and Sikh areas. The yellow areas are, in fact, separate states. So the princely states of Patiala, Nabha, Jind, Malerkotla, and so on and so forth. All the different kingdoms, little small kingdoms that had technically kept their independence in India, but were in fact puppet governments of the British. It's really important to remember that the British didn't directly rule over all of India. They directly ruled over parts of India. Other parts of India were still ruled by their old kings and queens that had been there for many generations. But those kings and queens acted on the advice of a British representative, which told them what to do. So essentially, the British controlled all of India. Some of it they controlled directly, and some of it they controlled indirectly. In Punjab, there were huge parts of Punjab, this whole Patiala, Nabha, Jind, Malerkotla, and other areas, which were not directly governed by the British, but were governed by these puppet states instead. On the other hand, you had um, um, the areas that were directly governed by the British. And this was all of Punjab that had been formerly ruled by the Khalsa kingdom, by the Sarkari Khalsa of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So all of those areas that had been directly governed by Maharaja Ranjit Singh became directly governed by the British after the end of Sikh rule. You can see that this area was a majority Muslim area. The whole left part of the map is majority Muslim. Now, that does not mean that 100% of the population in those areas is Muslim. And on the right-hand side of the map, the areas that are red and yellow are not majority Hindu and Sikh. Sorry, they are majority Hindu and Sikh, but they're not a complete 100% majority Hindu and Sikh. There's a lot of Muslims living in those areas as well. So there's a lot of intermixing. There's a lot of Sikhs and Hindus living in Muslim-dominated areas. There's a lot of Muslims living in Hindu and Sikh-dominated areas. It's not a clear distinction. There are some areas which are more Muslim and some areas which are less Muslim. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that 53% of India's population and of Punjab's population in 1941 was Muslim. 53% is a majority. Hindus were 30% of Punjab at the time. And remember that Punjab at the time was not just the modern state of Punjab, but also the states of what became Himachal Pradesh and Haryana, and of course, what we call West Punjab, which was now Pakistan Punjab. So Hindus had 30% of all of that area's population. Sikhs were just 14% of the United Punjab's population. So we were really a minority within the state. That's not something that we talk about a lot when we talk about India or talk about pre-partition Punjab. A lot of us kind of have this image that Sikhs were a majority in Punjab, that Punjab was the homeland of the Sikhs, and therefore Sikhs dominated Punjab. Sikhs did dominate Punjab politically for a long time because of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, but we were always a minority within the state as a whole. When the British came, our percentage was pretty low, 14.9% by 1941. So you can see that in fact, Sikhs were not a majority in any one district of Punjab except for the Ludhiana district. In every other district of Punjab, either Muslims or Hindus were the majority. Sikhs were not a majority even in Amritsar district, in Gurdaspur district, in all of these other districts of Punjab, there were large Hindu populations, and Sikhs were not a majority in any of them except for the Ludhiana district. So this is a demographic conundrum, as you can see. If you're going to split up this country, how are you going to split it up? Let's now turn to Sikh politics. The Akali Dal was a premier Sikh political party. It had emerged from the Gurdwara reform movement of the early 1920s. It was one of several factions in the Sikh world. So it represented a majority of Sikhs, but not all Sikhs were allied with the Shiromani Akali Dal. You had other groups, like people who were loyal to the British. You had communists. You had more conservative elements that were maybe pro-independence, but were not fully wanting a separate country. Maybe they wanted a dominion status, like Canada had. Um, uh, or South Africa had, or Australia or New Zealand had, where the Queen was still the head of state and the country was governed by a democracy, but it was not completely independent in the formal sense. So you had some conservative elements like that that didn't want complete independence from Britain, but wanted to have a dominion status for India, sorry. So the Shromani Akali Dal was just one group representing Sikhs at the time. They had the most prestige in terms of the Sikh population because they controlled the Gurdwaras. They controlled the Shromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee. And they were also the most vocal Sikh party advocating for independence from Britain. There were the communists as well who were advocating for independence from Britain, and there were a large number of Sikh communists, but they were never a Sikh party, of course. They were a communist party. So the only party that was exclusively Sikh that was asking for independence was the Shromni Akali Dal. In the early days of the Shromni Akali Dal, the main leader of the party was a man by the name of Baba Kark Singh. He was a really well-respected leader of the Gurdwara reform movement, someone fully committed to Sikh principles and a really incredible guy. But over time, he was eclipsed by a younger leader named Master Tara Singh. He was called Master Tara Singh because he had been a elementary school principal in his younger days, and so he had the title of master, which is a colonial title for a school principal back in the early 1900s. Master Tara Singh eclipsed Baba Kark Singh mainly because Baba Kark Singh was not open to, and this is ironic considering Baba Kark Singh's later positions, but in the mid 1920s and late 1920s, Baba Kark Singh was not open to working with the Congress Party closely, whereas Master Tara Singh did want to coordinate with the Congress Party in a larger struggle for independence from Britain. There's a lot of sort of intricacies involved, and I can recommend certain readings and books that will give more detail as to how that transfer of power happened, how Master Tara Singh emerged, and I've given some of those readings as the background readings for the class, and you should have received those before this class began. There's a very good book by J.S. Gadiwal that is a biography of Master Tara Singh, and it sort of goes over in detail what the Sikhs were experiencing from the 1930s all the way up to the 1960s, because he played a central role in Sikh politics throughout those 3 decades. So we got to a point where the Muslim League and other Muslim parties within India wanted a separate Muslim state uh, to be carved out of an independent India. What would this Muslim state look like? Well, these are all the areas of India that had significant Muslim populations. And at some points, there was a demand that all of these areas, in fact, be considered a separate Muslim state, which would have been quite chaotic and a little bit wild to have all of these small little islands of Muslim states surrounded by a Hindu country. The Muslims were really wary of dividing India into a state based on religion, one Muslim and one Hindu. They didn't actually want to do this at first, but communal riots and massacres started to happen more and more as the 1940s went onward. And they realized that it would be impossible for Muslims and Hindus to live together post independence. And so they finally conceded to the Muslim demand for a separate Muslim state within India. They weren't going to give it all of these different areas, though, because that would be make the country unworkable. Instead, they would look at Muslim-dominated states, areas that were on the peripheries of the Indian subcontinent, and allow those to become a new country of Pakistan. Whereas the other areas within the Indian continent, that subcontinent, which were Muslim-dominated, would in fact remain as part of India. Now, the original British proposal, as you can see here, the original British proposal had all of Punjab going to Pakistan. Now, the Akali Dal was really wary about this. They were like, we cannot allow ourselves to become part of a Muslim state. If we become part of a Muslim state, the Muslims will destroy us. This was a widespread belief of Sikh politicians and leaders at the time. There had been a lot of conflict between Muslims and Sikhs in the lead up to partition and independence. There had been long standing arguments and protests between the two communities. There had been a long standing fight, for example, over Gurdwara Shahida in Lahore, whereby Mani Singh and other Sikhs were shaheed. Muslims had wanted that property for a long time, and there was constant conflict between the two communities over that site. In other parts of Punjab, which were more Muslim dominated, Sikhs would face constant harassment and sometimes even murder from the Muslim majority. So Sikhs were really wary. They believed that if they were forced to join a Muslim country like Pakistan, that it would be the end of the Sikhs and Sikhs would be destroyed. And so while the British respected Sikhs because of our support of the colonial state, which we had supported quite a lot as part of the army and police forces especially, they really didn't respect the Sikhs as an equal partner in negotiations for independence, unfortunately. Sikhs needed to make sure that their demands were being recognized and that they kept their homeland somehow. How would they go about doing this? So, three choices came out of this conundrum. They could stay in a united Punjab under Pakistan, which was Muslim domination. They could split Punjab in half along demographic lines between Muslim and Hindu Sikhs. And this would be a divided, where Sikhs would have their homeland divided, and they would be under the domination of Hindus and Muslims. Or they could have a separate Sikh homeland, which was given different titles like Sikhistan, Khalistan, Maha Punjab, or Azad Punjab. Here's the reality of the situation. While Sikhs have been really insistent for the last several decades that we destroyed a really important opportunity, a precious opportunity to get our own separate homeland, looking at the British documents, looking at doing the research of the British negotiations with Nehru and Jinnah, the British never seriously considered giving Sikhs a separate state. That's the reality. And the reason why is because of that map that I showed you earlier. Sikhs were simply not a majority in any district except for Ludhiana area. How would we have formed a separate state when we weren't a majority in any part of Punjab, sorry. And because we were such a small percentage of the population in Punjab, the British were sort of like, whatever, you're going to be a part of Pakistan, just learn to live with it. And the Sikhs believed that their best chance of survival, their best chance of keeping the Panth intact and saving Sikhs was to join in with India and the Congress Party and divide Punjab and for Sikhs to undergo mass population transfer and join the India side of Punjab. That's what the Sikh leadership thought was the best idea for Sikhs to survive. Looking back with hindsight, was this the best choice? Well, obviously, it didn't work out so great for Sikhs in the end. At first, Sikhs had proposed a new state where no community would be the majority, where Muslims would be 40%, Hindus 40%, and Sikhs was 20% of the vote. They wanted to carve out a new border of Punjab where Sikhs were 20% of the population, where Hindus and Muslims were both below 50%. And so no religious group was the majority. And in fact, there would be strong protections for minorities. The demands for a Sikh state were mainly a bargaining tactic to put pressure on the Muslim League, Congress, and the British. But, like I said earlier, The British never really considered giving Sikhs a separate state as a realistic possibility, unfortunately. That was just not something that was ever really on the table, unfortunately. There is an alternative proposal, and the great Sikh scholar Sardar Kapoor Singh writes about this extensively in his famous book Sachi Sakhi. And he states that, in fact, joining with the Hindus and the Congress Party was the wrong choice, and that we should have, in fact, joined with Pakistan because Jinnah had offered us certain special safeguards to protect our rights if Sikhs had stayed within a united Punjab. He believed that this was far superior to joining Hindu India. I'm not sure, to be honest, whether that would have been a better option. We don't know, of course, this is just a theory of Sardar Kapoor Singh's. Would it have been better to join Muslim India, which became Pakistan? Would they have safeguarded our rights in the long term? Who knows what the demographic structure of Pakistan would have been like with a large and huge Sikh population within it? Who knows how we would have impacted Pakistan politics and what role we would have played in Pakistan politics? Who knows what the struggle between Pakistan and India would have looked like in a situation where Sikhs had joined and Punjab had completely joined Pakistan? Things would have turned out so differently that it's really hard to hypothesize how things would have looked. Majority of the leadership at the time, people like Master Tara Singh and Gyani Kartar Singh and other top Sikh leaders of the time, all believed that joining a united Punjab under Pakistan, under Muslim domination, would have been a suicide, um, like an existential threat to the Sikh nation, to the Sikh people. And that our only option was to join Hindu India, to join the Congress Party, and to create a supposedly secular state where minority rights would be protected. Now, Congress very much wanted the Sikhs on their side. They wanted the Sikhs on their side because they wanted half of Punjab and because Sikhs were a really strong political force even under British rule. We were a small, tiny percentage of India's population, less than 2%, but we were the majority of the people who had fought for independence, majority of the people who had been executed by the British, majority of the people who were killed at Jallianwala Bagh, majority of the people who had been arrested by the British. The Sikhs were the majority for all of those different numbers. So Sikhs were a potent political force, even if we did not have the population numbers to back that up always. And so both Nehru and Gandhi in the 1930s, here we can see two promises that were made in the early 1930s, had made promises to the Sikhs that if Sikhs joined India and Punjab was partitioned, and the Sikh part of Punjab joined India, that Sikh rights would be protected and there would be certain minority protections for Sikhs in the new structure of the Indian state. Gandhi even went so far as to say, and you can see the quote in the last two sentences, moreover, the Sikhs are brave people. They know how to safeguard their rights by the exercise of arms if it should ever come to that. So this man who was a committed pacifist was like, you know what, Sikhs don't need to worry. We're not going to break our promise with them. And even if we do, Sikhs have weapons and they know how to ensure their own rights. He made the speech at Sisganj Gurdwara in 1931 in front of a large Sikh population. Nehru also promised several times that Sikhs would get special consideration and they would experience the quote unquote glow of freedom. So these were the promises that were made to Sikhs pre-partition, pre-independence, in order to get the Sikhs on to the Congress Party side. Under the leadership of Master Kalidal, Master Tara Singh, the Kalidal agreed to join Gandhi and Nehru under the Congress Party banner. This was because of Sikh history and being wary of Muslim domination. So now that the Sikhs had formally decided to join the India side of the country, of the split between India and Pakistan, how would Punjab be split? And that is where we come to partition. Partition started to become a reality even before actual partition happened. In March of 1947, there was the Rawalpindi massacre. Rawalpindi is a town in Pakistan, Punjab now. 8,000 Sikhs and Hindus were killed in Muslim-led mob violence. It was pretty horrific. You can see British officials on the ground after the killing of Sikhs and Hindus. So these massacres of Sikhs and Hindus in Muslim-dominated areas started to occur even before August of 1947, before independence and partition happened. As the discussion of partition started to become a reality, Muslim-dominated areas of Punjab started to target Sikhs and Hindus because they wanted to force them out of their areas and they wanted to create a singular Muslim state within Punjab. The question had always been where to draw the border. On the left-hand side, you can see the Congress and Sikh choice of where the border should be. It cuts Punjab in half. On the right, you have the Muslim idea of where the border should be. It keeps all of Punjab together within a united Pakistan. The problem for the Sikhs was that we were not a majority anywhere except for one district. We wanted to keep our population together. At the same time, in Muslim-dominated areas of Punjab, we had important Gurdwara and historical sites, like Nankana Sahib, like Banja Sahib, like all of the important buildings of Lahore, where the Sikh Empire had been. It became clear pretty early on in 1947, 46, and 47 that a huge transfer of population was a necessity if partition were going to happen. Sikhs in Muslim areas would have to move to the India side, and Muslims on the India side would have to move to the Pakistan side. As violence erupted against Sikhs and Hindus on the Muslim side, violence started to erupt on the other side against Muslims, or threats of violence, at least at first, against Muslim populations in East Punjab, sorry. There were a lot of different ideas of how India should be split up. Sikhs believed that population should not be the only marker of how a state should be split up, because Sikhs had developed large parts of what we now call Pakistan Punjab, the area called the Bad. The Bad area had been an underdeveloped area of Punjab. The Sikhs had built a large canal system with British help and had irrigated a large amount of land that had become quite fertile, and Sikh land ownership in this area was quite large, but our population was small. We owned a lot of land. We had developed a lot of the area. This is around the Rawalpindi area and Nankana Sahib and other parts like that. We had developed a lot of the land. We owned a large number of farms in the area, but our population was still very small compared to the Muslim majority. So Sikhs believed that economics Land ownings and historical and religious sites should be taken into consideration when deciding where to split Punjab. Muslims decided that population should be the only metric of how to split Punjab. The areas that were majority Muslim should naturally become part of Pakistan, they believed. Sikhs were vehemently against this because that meant that they would lose all of this area that they had cultivated and developed and spent lots of money into creating it into an economic power, as well as they would lose all of these historical gurdwaras like Dera Sahib, Panja Sahib, and Nankana Sahib, as well as hundreds of other gurdwaras and historical sites. The British had this really unsolvable problem in front of them: who to listen to, how to divide things up, what to do. So the British leaving India was supposed to be a really managed, organized affair. It was supposed to happen in this really, because it was a transfer of power, it was supposed to happen in this very methodical way. As we got closer and closer to the date where the British were going to leave, things started to fall apart more and more, though. Conflict started to erupt on both the Muslim side and the Sikh and Hindu side, as minority populations started to be targeted by the majority, and both sides wanted to ensure that they got the most land possible in the new partitioned Punjab. Punjab quickly descended into bloodshed and into chaos. Partition is really one of the most horrific events in human history. It is the largest migration in human history. It's really something to think about. Over 20 million people were displaced. 20 million people, both in Punjab and Bangladesh, the two states that were split in partition. Ironically, it was Punjabis and Bengalis who were the majority population who had fought for India's independence. And these were also the two states which happened to be the ones that were split: Punjab and Bengal. There was a huge transfer of population, Hindus and Sikhs going to the India side, and Muslims going from the India side to the Pakistan side. It was pretty horrific. Estimates for how many people died vary quite widely, but most scholars today have come to a consensus of some sorts that up to 3 million people were killed. 3 million people in the 1940s is a huge, I mean, 3 million people at any time is a huge number of people. In the 1940s, that's a significant amount of Punjab's population was killed. Really huge. I can't under, I can't overstate how horrific partition was, how many people were killed, the level of violence, the chaos that ensued. It was really just unparalleled disaster in Punjab's history. There was massive sexual violence that also occurred that is rarely talked about even to this day. Because of notions of honor, Sikh women were encouraged to kill themselves to avoid being raped by Muslim mobs. This is for Sikh and Hindu populations on the Muslim side of the border. Famously, in a band called Toa Khalsa, 90 women in that village killed themselves by drowning to save, quote unquote, save themselves from the British. Some scholars estimate that 75,000 women were abducted and raped during partition. Some estimates are even much higher than that. Sexual violence, it must be stated, and we must face up to this reality, was something that was used by all sides in partition violence. Muslims were guilty of it, but Sikhs and Hindus were also guilty of it as well. Nobody was innocent in partition. All sides engaged in horrific violence. Partition meant the loss of heritage. It meant the loss of things like Gurdwara Kartarpur Sahib, where Guru Nanak Sahib Ji made the first Sikh village. It meant the loss of Dera Sahib, where Guru Arjan Sahib Ji was Shaheed in Lahore. And it meant the loss of Nankana Sahib, where Guru Nanak Sahib Ji was born. Besides Panja Sahib and hundreds of other Gurdwaras and historical sites. Another thing that's rarely discussed is the fact that while Sikh and Hindus were slaughtered in West Punjab, in East Punjab, Sikhs engaged in mass killings of Muslims. And this would happen in an organized and systematic fashion. Sikh groups organized themselves and went through village by village and eradicated Muslim populations in East Punjab. Entire trains were sent back and forth, full of bodies, to both sides of the border. Muslim bodies were loaded onto trains going into Pakistan, and Sikh and Hindu bodies were loaded onto trains going into India. It was pretty horrific. That's why the legacy of partition is a really difficult one to face up to. It was such a scar on our collective consciousness as Punjabi people. However, it's also the only instance in Sikh history where Sikhs are not innocent in terms of human rights abuses. In every other major episode of violence, like the Kallukare, like all the persecution we faced in the 1700s, Sikhs did not engage in violence themselves against minority populations. However, in partition, all sides engaged in violence against minority populations, and all sides were guilty of horrific violence. And that's why the legacy of partition is so difficult to face up to. Because we also killed a lot of innocent people. And that's where a distinction needs to be made between Sikhs operating and Sikh principles. Sikhs on the ground were not acting according to Sikh principles and Sikh values. They were acting, in fact, counter to Sikh values and Sikh principles. But there was incredible ethnic cleansing happening on both sides of the border, and both sides were guilty of it. I will say that violence, riots, organized mob violence first started on the Pakistan side of the border. Muslims did first engage, like in Rawalpindi, in massacres of Sikhs and Hindus. But regardless of who started it, the end result was the same. Both sides engaged in violence. Who's to blame for all this violence? Who's to blame for partition? Oftentimes today, the narrative is that the British are to blame for it. And the British are a pretty good place to start because, of course, they were the colonial rulers, and if it hadn't been for them, none of this would have happened. In reality, though, the British didn't want partition to happen, and the British didn't want this violence to happen either. They had wanted a systematic transfer of power. They had wanted India to stay united as a country. And the partition of the country was not something that the British were particularly advocating for, and that's clear by looking at the records. The truth is that the Congress Party and the Muslim League are largely responsible for partition. They were the ones who were in charge on both sides, and they were the ones who stoked the fire and the flames of ethnic violence on both sides. Sikhs are not blameless, though, and that is very clear. Master Tara Singh and other Sikh leadership quite openly said, if Sikhs are killed in West Punjab, Muslims will suffer in East Punjab. They straight up said this several times and hinted at it several other times. Sikh groups created jathas that went and executed Muslim populations around East Punjab. So, the entrance into modern India, the birth of Sikhs into modern India, was bloody and horrific. A scale of violence that we really haven't still dealt with 7 decades later. Even now, stories of partition are just coming to light. Even now, families are still uncovering the history of that time. While we can go to Pakistan, Punjab today, especially as part of the diaspora, and we are greeted by Muslim Punjabis with a lot of love and affection, the reality is that 70 years ago, when this event happened, both sides were killing each other en masse in huge numbers. It was just really horrific violence. And I think that this entry into the Indian state, into the Indian government, into the Indian, the birth of India, if you will, being so horrific and violent, really was a harbinger of the future that Sikhs would face within India. We thought that we were getting something amazing and incredible with independence, and something that India has been celebrating and Pakistan has been celebrating for decades. But really, what have we been celebrating? Our homeland was ripped in two, our historical sites were lost, so much so that we changed our Panthikar Das because of the loss of history. And the economic damage of partition was really incalculable. We're talking about, in today's numbers, billions of dollars worth of damage. Just incredible amounts of economic loss. Families that owned large farms and huge amounts of property lost everything on both sides of the border. And Sikhs who had especially developed large parts of West Punjab lost a tremendous amount financially. And if they managed to survive partition with their lives, they came out as refugees on the other end with nothing to their name. They were given certain amounts of land in certain areas to make up for their losses. Oftentimes, this land was subpar and not of good quality. Entire populations, communities of Sikhs that had been living in places for hundreds of years, since the time of the Gurus, lost their communities. Muslims who had been living in East Punjab for hundreds of years, communities that had been a vibrant part of Punjab for hundreds of years, were lost. And there was a loss of culture, the loss of cultural exchange between Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu Punjabis was really just incredibly tragic and horrific. So, in this, our first session today, we've covered the promises that Congress leaders made to the Sikhs before 1947. These promises encouraged Sikhs and the Sikh political parties, especially the Shromani Akali Dal, which was the majority party of the Sikhs at the time and the main party advocating for independence, to throw in their lot with the Congress party and for Sikhs to join India instead of joining Pakistan. Sardar Kapoor Singh and others like him believed that this was a mistake and that we should have joined Pakistan instead of India. Or others believe we should have gotten a separate state. The reality is that a separate state was not really ever on the table from the British side. I have found no credible evidence that the British ever really considered giving the Sikhs a separate state. This was not something that the British ever seriously considered. And the plain and simple reason, and one that is difficult for us to admit to even today, is purely because of demographics. We simply were not the majority in any parts of Punjab except for one district. And so, how would you carve up Sikh state out of Punjab when Sikhs were a minority almost everywhere in Punjab? It would be really difficult. Sikhs had made a proposal for a new state where Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs lived together, and there were strong protections for minorities. But this became a non starter for the Muslims because they simply didn't want to be a part of India. The threat of an independent Sikh homeland was used as a bargaining chip in negotiations, but in reality, it was never something that actually was seriously considered by any of the sides, including the Sikh side. So, this narrative that we've had for a lot of decades now that Master Tata Singh and other Sikh leadership really screwed us over, and that we made this crazy mistake in 47, and that we could have gotten our own separate state and we didn't, doesn't really hold up to scholarly investigation, unfortunately. I would love to say, yeah, there was a serious chance that Sikhs would have a separate state, but it was not something that was ever on the table. The reality is that from the point of view, from the perspective of the Sikhs alive during that time, joining India was the most sensible option. It was the most sensible option because there had been long-standing historical difficulties with the Muslim population. The Muslims had ruled over Punjab for centuries, and they had persecuted Sikhs when they had ruled over Punjab. There was still violence between Muslims and Sikhs all the way up into the 1940s. And so Sikhs did not trust the Muslim population of Punjab. Sikhs thought we should be with the Hindus. We have suffered together with the Hindus. Culturally, we have a lot more similarities, and we will be able to work together. The distinction between Sikh and Hindu and Muslim was something that was really strong even before partition, and this is not something that a lot of us realize. So, in most villages in Punjab, while Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims lived together and worked together, they would not eat together, for example. Muslims would not eat with Sikhs, and Sikhs would not eat with Muslims. The idea of a Muslim family converting to Sikhi was so controversial in the early 1910s that entire segments of the Sikh population boycotted the Amritsar where this happened. Because the idea of a Muslim becoming a Sikh was so contrary to what Sikhs perceived to be what was right. I'm not saying that that was a good thing, and that family that converted to Sikhi ended up becoming a really important family in the Bantha and a really incredible story. But, for example, Baidentir Singh of the Kankirtani Jatha took Amrit with that Muslim family, and he was stopped from having langar at certain gurdwaras after he had received Amrit with the Muslim family because people said, you have drank from a bhatta with Muslims and you cannot sit in our langar here because you've drank together with Muslims. You've eaten together with Muslims, even though they were converting to Sikhi in an Amritsar. So that was a level of antagonism between Muslim and Sikhs pre-partition. They lived together, they were friends, they worked together, but they did not have close familial relations in the way that Sikhs and Hindus had. That's the reality. Even though today, when we go to Pakistan, we're treated with a lot of respect and love, pre-partition, that wasn't really the case. So we're going to wrap it up there for today. I know we covered quite a lot of history today. We looked at early Congress promises to the Sikhs starting in the 1930s. We looked at a brief history of Sikh politics. And we looked at in depth partition, how it happened, and why it happened, and who is to blame for it. We talked about the drawing the borders of Punjab, and we talked about the way that the transfer of power happened between the British and the Congress Party and the Muslim League. And with there, I'll wrap up for now. Thank you for attending this first class. We will now move on to questions that have been asked.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sanfeji, for week 1 of our course. There were a couple of questions that were of a similar nature. So I'll ask just one of them because the spirit of them was quite similar. So one of the questions were, where did the people or citizens, I guess in this case, the two leaders that were in charge of partition, where did they get the idea of forming race-based parties or having race-based politics, the Congress and the Muslim League? And you can comment on the language as well. Is this a direct consequence of the British concept of divide and rule, as the similar race-based politics can be seen in other colonies like Malaysia? Yeah, so I guess, why was it separated on the basis of people who are Hindu, people who are Muslim?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the policies of the British. The British, in their censuses, in the way that they administered Punjab and India, really divided people along ethnic and caste lines. To say that the divisions of people along religious lines were purely a product of the British, though, is an oversimplification as well. So the British had a huge role to play in it. The British ideas of colonial structures, of census making, of asking people their race formally, and making sure that they chose one or another race definitely played a role, but it was not the complete picture. The story of how the Congress Party and the Muslim League came into being is a much more complicated story, and I would encourage people to look at late colonial British history of South Asia to really get a bit better picture of that era. Essentially, what was happening was that there was different groups advocating for power in the vacuum that was going to be created by the British. Some of these were not religious based, they were economic based, like the communists. Some of them were secular based, like the groups that wanted India to be a dominion of Britain and not to be completely independent. But for whatever reason, the groups that became dominant were the Muslim League and the Congress Party. But even into the late 1930s and early 1940s, when there were elections in Punjab, a Muslim party came into power that was not the Muslim League and that had support of conservative Sikh elements within the party. So the Muslim League actually sort of punched above its weight class, you can say. Like it claimed to represent all Muslims at a time when it didn't represent all Muslims, but over time, because it kept saying it and because the British kept treating it like it did represent all Muslims, they eventually started to represent all Muslims, ironically. So yeah, that's a short answer. The longer answer is a little bit more complex. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. There's also a question here. Some people argue that Jinnah was the one trying to keep India together and Nehru was the one maybe forcing the break. Also that Sikh leadership didn't foresee Congress intentions the way Jinnah did. Do you have any thoughts on this? And kind of in the same vein, were the promises that were made to minority communities, were these more verbal, or was there anything more formal proposed?
Yeah, that's one of the big mistakes of the Sikhs, is that most of these promises, in fact, all of them that were made to Sikhs, were verbal. There was no real, I mean, they were put into print in the sense that they were released in like official Congress documents and official Congress resolutions. So no, they were put into print, but they were nothing was became a law because of course Congress wasn't in charge of the government at the time yet. The real test, and this is what will happen in our next class, which we will talk about right at the beginning of the next class, is when the Constitution was made for India. Because that's where it became clear, would these promises be upheld or would they not be? What would India look like actually? How would it actually function day to day? So Sikhs really went in believing all of the statements. A lot of the promises were verbal, but a lot of the promises were written down, and like Congress would hold a like an annual meeting or an annual conference, and the resolutions that would come out of the conference would be like, we believe that Sikhs are an integral part of India and that they deserve these rights and so on and so forth. So that did happen a few times. In terms of Jinnah understanding the threat that Congress in India would have, he was very prescient. He did understand that. And he famously told Sikhs, you know Hindus as fellow people who have been oppressed. You don't know them as oppressors. And you don't know what you're up for if you choose their side. He very much understood that a Hindu dominated India would be a real tragedy for minority populations. Even for a Muslim population that was so huge, it would still be a disaster. Is Congress more to blame for partition? I know that people like, and I see the question here, that Gurtej Singh said that Jinnah was the one trying to keep India together. I don't know if I completely buy that. Jinnah wanted to keep India together at the beginning, but with really pretty bold protections for Muslims within the Indian state. So bold that it made India almost unworkable. So that Muslims would have like a guaranteed 30 or 40% of the legislature, that decisions could not be made without the Muslim minority agreeing to them, things like that, like certain key rules that would be put into place to ensure that the Muslims were not ignored in the new state of India. But once Pakistan as an idea was floated, the Muslim League really jumped on board with that pretty strongly. And my reading of it, and of course my reading of it is my own perception, and I would recommend people who are interested to do their own research. My reading of it seems pretty clear that the Muslim League really did want a separate country, and that Congress agreed to this because they knew that they would have a more workable country without a large Muslim population there. So it worked to the benefit for both the Muslims and the Hindus. So I don't know if Jinnah was the one trying to keep India together and Nehru was the one forcing the break. I don't think that's totally accurate. I think forcing the break worked out to the benefit of both Congress and Muslim League. But Muslim League definitely, Jinnah definitely did know, like, you know, you guys are going to suffer under India. And that was a real statement he made. And that was something that ended up being quite true. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have time for one, maybe two more questions. So yeah, I'll start it off with this one. It said that what came to be known as the Khalistan movement during the late 70s and 80s originated way before even the partition, along with the SGPC's reforms in the 1920s. Yeah, during the time period that we just had a discussion about, how strong was the Khalistan movement in the years leading up to the partition, and did it have any impact during the roundtable conferences or the conversations where much of the partition dynamics were shaped?
Yeah, so the term Khalistan was first heard around that time period. It was a pamphlet put out by a Sikh author, the idea of Khalistan being a separate Sikh state. And it was a response to the idea of Pakistan. So Khalistan first originated as an idea there, as a mass movement of the people. It was never as large as it was in the early 90s. It simply was not what the majority of Sikhs in British India were demanding or wanting. A few leaders and a few thinkers were advocating for it, but the majority of Sikhs were standing behind the Shromani Akali Dal. That's where the Shromani Akali Dal got its power. It's not like they were just leaders without a population standing behind them. They had the Sikh majority behind them. And the Sikh majority wanted to stay within India and wanted to be separate from the Muslims. And that's just the reality of it. The idea of a separate Sikh state was advocated a few times, but it was always used as a bargaining chip. Master Thadasan did come up with the idea of a Maha Punjab or Azad Punjab, but this was not a separate country of Punjab. This was that structure of Punjab where Muslims would have 40%, Hindus 40%, and Sikhs 20%. It was a redrawing of Punjab's borders, but it was within India. It was not a separate country. So Azad Punjab and Maha Punjab were advocated as entities that existed within India. So that's important to remember as well. So while the idea of Khalistan, the idea of Khalistan really originates with Guru Granth Sahib Ji, if we're being realistic about it. The idea of a separate Sikh Raj, separate Sikh entity, a separate sovereign Sikh state, really begins with Guru Nanak Sahib Ji creating Kartarpur Sahib. So it's an idea that always existed. It was given the name Khalistan in the 1940s for the first time. And it was then, at that point, treated as a nation-state idea. But it was never a large-scale movement, unfortunately. The large-scale movement, what the majority of Sikhs at the time wanted was to be a part of India, because they believed that being a part of Pakistan would be a disaster, and the Muslims would be a disaster for Sikhs.
Awesome. We will have one more question. And this ties into something I was curious about as well. One of our attendees asked, did women play a role in the Akali Dal? And then more generally, I'm wondering about folks who maybe belonged to a religious community but didn't identify with those communities. Where were they? Where were they in these conversations? So yeah, two questions, I guess.
A great question, a really good question. And unfortunately, in any presentation that I do or class that I teach, I always try to bring in a Sikh female perspective and a Sikh low caste perspective. But unfortunately, when we're talking about pre-partition Punjab, we're talking about a very gendered society. We're talking about a society where women do not and were not playing a public role at all. Women were in the house, women were in private spheres, and in all of the communities, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh, there were no major female leaders in either of these communities. Women were, of course, a part of the population, and they had a role to play in terms of the support they provided to a certain community's ideas. But there were no prominent women leaders, unfortunately, in any of the communities in Punjab. And there was no real public sphere for women to take part in political decision making in that era, unfortunately. And similarly, Punjab politics at the time were dominated by upper caste groups, by upper caste and Jat groups. and low caste Sikhs were also shut out of decision making at the time. So minority populations, both women and Majbi Sikhs or Ramgarhia Sikhs or um, uh, Ravidasya Sikhs, were all not part of this decision-making process of what to do post-independence. That was dominated by other groups within the community. In terms of people who were not religious, I mean, there were plenty of people who were not religious, people who just said they were Muslim or Hindu or Sikh, but weren't like fully practicing. But almost everybody at least claimed identity with one community. There was like very, very, very insignificant minority that would say, I'm not part of any religion. And so even people who were not like, who may not practice Maryada, who may have been drinking, who may be doing other things, they would not have, they would still have considered themselves to be Sikh. There was also real social divisions that existed between the Muslim and Sikh population, the largest one being meat. So a majority of Sikhs ate meat at the time, but they would not eat meat slaughtered by Muslim butchers. This was very strict for Sikhs, and this was a constant source of conflict. It's not something we hear about anymore because we don't live with Muslims anymore in Punjab. But back then, this was like a big issue. Like Sikhs protested for the right to have chatka meat at government institutions, at government schools, at bureaucracies. Like this was a constant fight for Sikhs to have chatka meat, because Sikhs would not eat meat butchered by Muslims, and Muslims would not eat meat butchered by Sikhs. And so there was a real actual distinction between the two communities that today seems a little weird, but back then was actually a big deal that this division existed between Muslims and Sikhs. The largest population of people that I would say were not one community or the other would probably be the communists, but even those communists were physically look like Sikhs if they were Sikhs. So while they may not have been practicing Sikhs, they still would have had their dadis and their dastas, you know? Like people cutting their hair, Sikhs cutting their hair was pretty unheard of at the time. There was a very small Christian population in Punjab at the time, smaller than today, and they would have been the only ones who would have cut their hair in terms of people who would formerly look like Sikhs and who would stop being Sikhs. But non-practicing Sikhs would have kept their hair at that time too. People would not have really been cutting their hair at that time. That was a more modern phenomenon. So almost everybody really had been divided by the British into certain religious communities, but they had also themselves very formally been like, this is my community, this is what represents me, this is who speaks for me. And the political parties had emerged out of that milieu to represent different groups. Like Congress was supposed to represent everybody, but the reality was that Congress was representing upper caste North India Hindus, right? Like South India Hindus were not part of it, low caste Hindus were not part of it, Muslims were not really part of it, Sikhs were not really a part of it. Akali Dal represented Sikhs, Muslim League represented Muslims, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Santvirji. I'm wondering, before I close things out, is there anything that you wanted to add? Yeah.
Well, I just ask everybody to join us next week for sure, because we're going to be getting into some pretty interesting things in the oncoming weeks. Next week, we'll be talking about the Constitution of India, and we'll be spending a lot of time on something called Punjabi Suba, which is what Sikhs advocated for in huge numbers throughout the 1950s and 1960s. In the weeks after that, we'll be looking at things like the Green Revolution, the Amritsar Massacre, the Anandpur Sahib Resolution, and finally, in the last week, we will be looking at the lead up to 84 with the Dharmyuddha Morcha and increasing violence against the Sikhs. So we're going to get more and more narrow in our focus as the decades move on. This will cover the most amount of time, this first class, and the last class will cover really only a couple of years. So as we get closer to 84, we're going to narrow in and get more focused in our detail. But yes, join us next time. The Constitution of India has been really a source of conflict and simply heartache for Sikhs since it was created. And let's talk about why that is and what about it was so offensive and remains offensive to Sikhs, and why they've never supported the Constitution of India, this very important document which determines how the country operates. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. And as Sankhbir Singh shared, do please join us next week for week 2 of our course. On behalf of SikhRI, I thank Sankhbir Singh and our e-Sangats today. Thank you all for tuning in and spending time with us. Join in for week 2 of our course, where we'll examine Sikh-India relations post-1947, focusing on the 1950s and 60s. We'll look at the emergence of Sikh demands in the aftermath of independence, the formulation of the Indian Constitution, and the epic struggle to create a Punjabi-speaking state.
I had one other thing. Sorry, Manvinder.
Sure. No, go ahead.
I'd seen a question someone asked for books. Yeah, if you look at the syllabus that we sent out to all people who registered, they should have all gotten the syllabus, right?
Yes.
It has readings in there, further readings that they can do, and readings to prepare for each class. So that should hopefully answer that question. Yes.
Yes. And to close out, don't forget to tune into the Sikhcast, a podcast produced by SikhRI, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in today. Today's online course will be ending now. Vaigu Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaigu Ji Ki Fateh.